get our focus closer to home and in a couple respects, both in terms of Illinois, but also the world of higher education. And I really couldn't think of a better person to begin this conversation with than Teresa Amott, who is the president of Knox College. Teresa is widely known as one of the most interesting and dynamic college presidents in Illinois and even across the country. And I should say, let me just tell you a little bit about Teresa, and then we'll go right into the conversation. Teresa, I teased her when we talked earlier this week, because we could spend this whole hour talking about her life before Knox. She comes from a foreign service family. Her dad was in the foreign service. Her parents actually met at the U.S. Embassy in Brazil. And then she's had a rich life overseas growing up, spent time in places like Bolivia, Japan, Peru, Honduras, Mexico, Germany, and Portugal. She went back to the U.S. to go to college, getting a bachelor's degree at Smith College in economics and then a doctorate in economics at Boston College. She describes her life as one college tour. She began teaching at Wellesley College, taught at UMass for a while, and then has held faculty and administrative positions at Bucknell and Gettysburg College. And prior to starting a presidency at Knox about a decade ago, she had spent 6 years as the provost and dean of faculty at Hobart William Smith Colleges in New York. So, and I should say, as in a word of kind of full disclosure, that I've known Teresa for a bit. I'm a Knox graduate, and Teresa has been Knox's president for about a decade. So we've had some wonderful chances to visit over the years and had wide-ranging conversations on politics and diplomacy and higher education and all. So, and I should add, Teresa is Knox's 19th president in its 180-year history and the first woman president. So that's something that I know the university, or the college, is just very proud of. And Teresa, the one thing that we're not so happy about is she announced this spring that at the end of next year, she's going to be retiring after a decade of leading Knox. And I think everyone is very grateful for her really remarkable service. So let me maybe begin our conversation by picking up on the whole notion of a college presidency, because the college president is like one of the iconic positions, I think, in American life, and particularly in communities like Galesburg or Carbondale, where the president of the college or university is well known. They're an important part of the community. So Teresa, as you think about your decade as a college president, what are the sort of essential elements of the job of the college president, maybe in contrast to that of a provost? And also, what are the elements about the job that maybe you weren't expecting and would maybe have surprised, you have been surprised to know 10 years later what you've had to deal with?
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, John. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you. And I've much admired your work throughout the years, and now to have you back here in Illinois at the Paul Simon Institute and its very important contributions to public policy. And I'm really very pleased to be here, so thank you. You know, when I was a faculty member, my job was to specialize, was to know more about, in my case, labor economics than anybody else on the campus. That was it. And I perfected that, and I practiced that, and I did research in that area, and that's what I did. When you move up through the administrative ranks, and particularly when you become a college president, then it's all about being a generalist. It's about a set of skills that involve balancing different constituencies with very, very different interests. So that's a political job. It does involve seeing into the future. So you have to be, you have to have a crystal ball to be a college president. None of us looked far enough in advance to see a pandemic in our future, but we'll come back to that later. You have to have skills with different generations of people. Students today are very different from the students that I started my career teaching in the late 70s. Very, very different in terms of their family backgrounds, very different in terms of the percentage who are first generation students, who are from immigrant families, who are from low income families because of expansions in opportunity in higher ed, which are welcome for all of us. So you begin to move from a narrow specialization to a set of very broad skills, very broad constituencies, very broad tasks, and your capacity to do your work now becomes constrained by a whole set of factors that are not of your making. So you have to create opportunities to make a difference, even when you're very constrained, whether it's financially constrained or politically constrained. Certainly those of us in Illinois, the budget crisis and the political stalemate that accompanied that, none of us saw that coming. Those of us who educate low-income students in the state of Illinois saw our MAP grants threatened. This is a very important piece of the capacity of these families to afford higher education. So we were constrained by the state. Now we are constrained by a set of public health dictates that are none of us really imagined. So you have to find a way to be mission-based, to do value-based decision-making. We are mission-driven institutions, so how we fulfill that mission guides us all the time. And even though you may have a different mission in the flagship campus, you might have a different mission at ISU, you might have a different mission at a small liberal arts college, you might have a different mission at the University of Chicago. All of these different pieces of the higher ed ecosphere, we have our own missions. And so as the college president, your job is to achieve that mission, regardless of the constraints, regardless of the changes, regardless of the uncertainties. You've got to figure it out. And I love that challenge. It's an intellectual challenge, but it's a challenge of breadth. That is, it's just a lot of fun, actually.
Teresa, I was reading an essay about the challenge of being a college president, and this author argued that one of the real challenges is that a person comes to campus and they have sort of a theory of the case that they took through the interview process, and they, have laid out a 3-point plan to idolize, whether it's Knox or SIU. And then this person argued the key is to actually slow down and make sure that your theory of the case comports with reality on the ground, and meet various people and just kind of kick the tires and see what opportunities they are. So I wonder if you could talk about that, and then also from that leading into the strategic planning process, which I think you launched about a year or two after you started, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another version of that, making sure that your theory of the case is the right one, is that, oh gosh, I'm now forgetting who said it, that culture eats strategy for lunch. You have to figure out what the culture is of your institution. And in the case of a place like Knox, we've been developing our culture since 1837. And I usually refer to that as the institutional DNA. And DNA is kind of a reproductive mechanism, and it is passed down through the generations. So how is it that the DNA of Knox today is related to that of those founding abolitionists in 1837? Well, they hired people and attracted people and educated people, and the next generation of that institutional DNA then expressed itself. So when you get to a college, you have to find out whether the college that recruited you is the college that you now serve. And a lot of that depends on a really good search process. And if you have, in the case that I had, a broad and expansive and representative search committee, an opportunity to visit the campus and meet with lots of different people, then you do get a sense of the institution and its culture, and you get a sense of whether your particular skill set will help you advance that culture and meet those challenges in that moment. And all of those things kind of coming together. Now, strategic planning is also thinking about the future. So now you bring in other matters. You bring in potential constituencies, students that you don't currently have but might want to have, academic programs you don't currently have but think you should have. So in other words, you're trying to figure out how do you meet your mission in an unknown future. And so it does take a certain amount of imagination, but it's an imagination that is has to be culturally rooted, because you cannot turn Knox College into something else, no matter how long you're the president there. You can make it a better version of itself, and you can make it a broader more expansive, more inclusive version of itself. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a small college in Illinois, because you can't expand it that fast in this environment, with the kind of resource constraints we have.
So you put a fair amount of evidence or effort into the physical plant, the physical structure. You led some remarkable efforts to revive Alumni Hall and the Fine Arts Building and a science and math facility. Did you decide that was going to be critical to your legacy, is to just make the physical structure of the campus, relevant to the 21st century?
Well, that's a very interesting question, since, of course, I've spent the last 2 months turning it into a remote environment in which nobody's living there, right? So evidently not the right idea. Here's what I would say. It's not about the buildings. It's about what happens in the buildings. And so in the case of Alumni Hall, this was an extraordinary, beautiful, sort of Richardsonian Romanesque building that was dedicated in 1890 and had been shuttered in the 1980s. And so it sat on one side of a quad, essentially padlocked. And I thought that I didn't like the story that told about Knox, because it was not a story of institutional capacity, expansion, inclusiveness, imagination. It was shuttered, it was closed. And I thought the most important thing we have to do for a building that is called Alumni Hall is to reopen it. And to reopen it as a gesture to all of our alumni, you're one of them, to say you are a vital part of this institution, and your contributions, because we did it entirely, it was entirely grant funded. We don't receive a capital grant allocation from the state of Illinois. We did receive some grants through actually wonderful efforts of our representatives. But generally speaking, that was raised by alumni donations. And so those alumni donations reawoke that building. And it allowed us then to create a center that expressed the connections between the college and the greater world. So our study abroad office was in there. Our career center was in there. Our community service center was in there. And a center for research and advanced study, where our students go on to graduate work, for which we have always been known at Knox. Knox is well known for its extraordinary capacity to educate people in science and engineering and medicine and law after they leave Knox. So we set the stage, and they go on to graduate work. So that building then became that gateway. It was the gateway to the alumni. Alumni Affairs is in the building as well. It connected the college to the greater world. And so it told a story about a future for the college. It used to tell a story about a past, and now it told a story about the future. We've been working on our science building. Why? Because science is a very facilities intensive form of education, and it has to be a contemporary education. So why do the science building? Science matters. We're seeing that right now in this pandemic, how much of this is science driven, and Knox needs to be right there at the forefront of educating the scientists of the future. So again, it was never just we're going to do facilities, it's we're going to do certain facilities because they are critical to the mission of the institution moving forward.
Teresa, let's kind of fit Knox into the broader landscape of higher education in Illinois. And I guess one of the first questions is kind of a basic one, which is there a higher education community in Illinois, or are there an assemblage of sub-communities? You know, two Big Ten schools, you have four-year state institutions, you have several different types of private universities, you have community colleges. Is there like one general culture and then subcultures, or is it just everyone is kind of in their own little home and you get together very periodically when you're in Springfield testifying before committee? How does that work?
It's both. I think everyone that I know who has devoted their life to higher education understands that at the end of the day, it's about the students, whether they are graduate students or undergraduate students, international students or local students, adult students, returning students, students doing a range of post-secondary education, whatever it is that your market, your niche, your mission compels you to serve, it's about the students. And I find that when I'm in a room with college presidents, as you said, they could be Big Ten, they could be small colleges, they could be community colleges. We do share that desire to center our work on the success of our students. Now, we are competitors. We compete for students. We compete for state funds. We compete for dollars, for donations, charitable foundations, et cetera. But within that broad framework, I think there is a deep sense of shared mission that shows itself, honestly, at moments like this. I mean, I've been in gatherings with college presidents from across those different specters, and there is a kind of solidarity that we're going to get through this together, that the country needs us, the world needs us to get through this. And to continue the education, our students need us, their families need us. And so there is a shared mission, but certainly we compete in various ways, and there's an acknowledgement of that.
It seems like that all of you face an external environment that has a couple of components. I mean, first of all, you have a Midwest economy that even before this crisis was slow to emerge from the 2008, 2009 recession. So it was an economic constraint. You had, of course, a demographic challenge that is regional and profound that affects all of you. And then, as you said earlier, you have a political environment in which there has oftentimes been brinksmanship and stalemate, protracted, budget impasse that affected colleges. So if you can go through those three elements, the sort of economic, the demographic, and the political, and how they affect higher education in Illinois.
Well, certainly the demographics, very, very complicated for us. We at Knox recognize, 18 years in advance how many 18-year-olds there are going to be. So it's not as though you have no lead time on the demographic problem. We saw that coming. So at Knox, like many other institutions, we began to look to international students, and we began to identify other markets where we could bring students to the Midwest. Ironically, both of those now are sources of risk for us. They used to be risk mitigators. If there's fewer students in the Midwest, we'll get students from the South and from the West, and we'll get students from international students as well. Now, people may not want to travel and send their kids to school very far away, and then the question of immigration and the international travel issue is quite significant. The interesting thing about demography is it is, it's coming, so you can prepare to be smaller, or you could prepare to be bigger, but you can't do both at once. You have to decide what kind of an institution you are, and that's where the mission comes in again. So, Knox did not have aspirations of becoming a 50,000 student institution. We had aspirations of being the 4-year educational experience for students who would go out and lead the world, really, change the world and lead the world. But the demographics have been challenging, and they've put us now into competition with one another much more sharply than ever before. We now compete with students from in-state public, and those in-state public are competing for students with out-of-state publics who are seeking to raid the Illinois students. And I have talked to you before about the fact that some of our neighboring states are providing in-state tuition to Illinois graduates. So that led to the situation where Illinois became one of the top or the second most exporting states in the country for college students. So that competition has certainly intensified. The demographics and the competition come together in that regard. I mean, the budget crisis in Illinois now, I think we all began to see, it was just a dress rehearsal for the sort of collapse of bipartisanship over the last decade at the national level, and the larger national polarization. So certainly we have become more active as a sector in advocating for our interests. That's one of the places where we do all come together, where the publics and the privates do indeed go to Congress, we go to the state, to Springfield, and we advocate for the entire sector, where that rising tide can lift all the boats. I think the other complication for us was not the Midwestern. You and I have talked about this, and that was essentially a critique of the whole sector of higher education. It's a complicated critique. Some of it is about the practicality of a liberal arts education. I can talk about that in a minute. But the larger critique was about all of higher ed. The tuition costs were seen as really greed on the part of these institutions. The rise of big-time college athletics seen as exploiting student athletes. The issue of freedom of speech, the question of college students being polarized politically, but leaning perhaps a little more liberal, raising the question of whether they were brainwashed by faculty. You read a lot about that. The question of amenities, the question of whether our schools were spending money on fancy dorms and Starbucks coffee, et cetera, and neglecting the basics of education. The question of the so-called snowflake students, right? This generation of young people. All of that kind of rolled into the partisan polarization to create, I think, a real challenge to the legitimacy of higher education. Many people saw higher education as no longer necessary, no longer appropriate, and frankly, no longer above the fray, not a higher calling, a lower calling, if anything. Now that larger cultural war, it also manifests itself in very sharply partisan views on higher ed, depending on the two parties. That has been one of the areas where we've all come together as a sector to try to assert and defend our traditional values. That I think has brought us together. But I think on the liberal arts piece of it itself, some of that is just silly. So people have conflated humanities with the so-called liberal arts. The liberal arts include the sciences. So we have science, we have neuroscience, we have computer science, we have pre-engineering, and we are a liberal arts college. In other words, what we are is a place that broadly educates people. The liberality there is not a political statement, obviously, it's about breadth. But those also have been challenges for us as college presidents. And as college presidents, when you started, the iconic status of a college president used to be you walked into a room and people would say, oh, and we're delighted to see with us the president of Knox College. Well, now, you got to be careful. Somebody might hiss or boo if they heard that you were a college president. When I'm sitting on a plane and somebody says, well, what do you do? I say, well, I work at a college. I don't actually jump right out there and say I'm a college president because I'm going to hear the whole lecture or the whole flight. Of course, now I don't fly anymore. So long-winded answer, but complicated times.
Teresa, just in terms of, just to maybe pick up on the kind of management piece of a college, particularly when you started at Knox, did you, I'm sure no week was typical, but did you try to carve some elements into your week in terms of, visit a class, on a regular basis, or cafeteria or sporting events? I mean, what was your kind of routine to stay grounded in what was actually happening at the college?
Right. For me, it wasn't routine because your schedule is so unpredictable. It was more a matter of ensuring that I had visibility to students and with students. It often happened that was a soccer game on a weekend because I was booked 9 to 5. So yes, you do want to come to some of those events, and you want to be with students. You want to have an opportunity to talk to the student senate, to student government. You want to be sure that you know what's on their minds. You want to read the student newspaper. You want to call the student newspaper the journalists when they've got it right and when they've got it wrong. You want to have connection with faculty. I attend every faculty meeting. So yes, you need to be in touch with the day-to-day reality, but I will say the days in which a college president would teach a course every single term and be a member of the faculty, those are vanishing. It is harder and harder to stay in touch precisely with that aspect of the work.
Well, Teresa, let's turn to the spring, because in February you talked to the Knox's board of trustees and said that you would had decided that in a year that you would be stepping down, and had laid out an agenda, including continuing to work on shoring up the school's finances and enrollment and so forth. And then about 2 weeks later, word of a virus starts hitting the country in a profound way. And all of a sudden now you're scrambling, figuring out in early March what to do with spring term. So pick up the story there in spring. Tell us about your spring.
Right. So what I've noted about that time period is, first of all, today I think is March 97th. It's been a complete blur. The days have ceased to distinguish themselves one from another because all of the routine that we counted on to differentiate one day from the other disappeared. Now, in our instance, we were at 100% in-person education. We had no remote education, no online education at all. And so in 2 weeks, we pivoted and moved our entire curriculum online. In 2 weeks, we got 1,000 students home, and some of them couldn't get home because they might be international students. So we set up a small college within a college, and we have 160 students living on campus. In 2 weeks, we had to assess the budget, the finances of the institution, because we had to refund almost $3 million in room and board. So, I've joked with people that in 2 weeks, we essentially reinvented the college. We did what had been done since 1837 to the present in designing the college we had. We designed an entirely new college in 2 weeks. And my joke is, I'm not sure we could have gotten a permit for a food truck in 2 weeks. And then we stood up an entirely different college. What I think has been the financial challenges are profound, existential, and for particularly the smaller colleges, but even the larger colleges. I mean, when major research universities are doing layoffs and furloughs, pay cuts, their presidents are taking very large pay cuts, places with billion-dollar endowments, that this is serious. This is not just about a small college in a rural area. This is about the sector. It is a threat to the entire sector. I think for most of us since then, the issue has been to do what I said before, that mission-driven decision-making, that value-based budgeting, to say what is essential that we protect, what must we preserve in this time of calamity and peril. For us, again, that founding by abolitionists, what we have to protect is access for the most vulnerable. We have students who live in rural areas and don't have access to good Wi-Fi. So how were we going to do instruction for a student who could not, in fact, get a reliable Wi-Fi connection? How were we going to do instruction for the international students who have been with Knox from the beginning? We have had international students from Africa in the 1830s. So the diversity of our student body, our low-income students, our international students, our students of color, our DACA students, for example. How do we protect those most vulnerable? How do we protect our faculty and staff who are vulnerable either through pre-existing health conditions from what at that time appeared potentially to be something that could overwhelm even those of us here in Galesburg. So when we went to work to reinvent the college, we didn't reinvent our values. We didn't reinvent our mission. What we figured out was, how were we going to deliver it under these new conditions? And it was a scramble. The senior staff met every single day, and we made provisional decisions that 2 days later we had to scrap and start over again. We were going to meet socially distanced in a big room, and then 2 days later it was clear we couldn't do that. So we started doing everything by WebEx. Having a faculty meeting. We can't have a faculty meeting because, you know, it's 100 people. So we're now doing them on WebEx. So each step of this pandemic, when the state closed and the stay-at-home order came into effect, yes, education was an essential area, but not everyone was essential there. So it was a scramble. We've reinvented ourselves. We've also had to reinvent ourselves as guardians of the public health. That's something we never thought about before. We thought about protecting our students from harassment or sexual misconduct. We did not think about protecting our students from a global pandemic. So it has been at Knox and every other place, this important moment of trying to deliver your mission, to act in accord with your values, but in a world very substantially changed overnight.
Well, Teresa, tell us about the fall. I mean, this has been one of the great debates in American life right now. And, you know, it's not even just in the academic press, but in the national press. I mean, obviously on one extreme, you have people say universities and colleges are pivotal to the American economy. Of course, they have to start up in the fall. The other school says there's no scenario they can start up in the fall. You have hundreds of thousands of students coming from across the world, traveling, living in close proximity. Nothing good can happen from that arrangement. So with that kind of, you know, really profound debate going on, how has Knox thought about the fall? What kind of contingency plans have you put together? How does it look right now to you?
Right. You know, here's a moment where our being small helps us, because we do not rely on 500 student lectures or 1,000 student lectures. Our business model does not require Big Ten sports and people in a stadium. We're in a situation in which it is a matter of scale, but it's not unimaginable for us to reopen. So we're starting with the public health question. So if we are advised by one of our professional associations, the American College Health Association, that it is important, by the way, I don't know if you can hear that, another essential worker is outside picking up my trash, so apologies if you're hearing too much noise there, but we're grateful for their service. For us, it starts with, well, how do we house them? Because we're a residential institution. So if we were to put every student in a single room, we start there. That's about 580 students. Unfortunately, to be financially viable, we have to be close to 900 or 1,000. So we start with 585 students. Now, we do not think we'll get international students. We are essentially assuming that they will not be able to travel and that they can't get visas. That is, are entering new students, first-year students, because all the consulates are closed. So we also start from the assumption that we want them to come eventually. So we're going to have to do some remote instruction. They will not be physically present on campus. There will be some students who have to do remote instruction because of pre-existing health situation. So maybe 585 on campus in single rooms, maybe 100 to 200 remote. Maybe we can contract with local hotels for single rooms. And so we started those conversations. So maybe there'll be another 100 in local hotel rooms. Maybe some of our students will already live off campus in apartments or with their families. So we begin to build what we consider to be a number of students that we can safely educate within the parameters of the public health. Okay, that's the first step. What can we do safely? Keeping in mind that we have vulnerable students among us, and we have to make sure that however we have to care for them as well. Now we move to the next question, which is how do we deliver that education to this number of students that we think is our maximum safe capacity? And as I said already, we can do some of it in person. If we can do groups of under 10, then we will have to split up our faculty. Maybe they'll do a lecture online, and then they will have some discussion groups that will be in person and some discussion groups that won't be, because those will be students who cannot get here or should not be exposed to other students. So now we begin to develop an educational model. What about the possibility that we have a spike in the fall? Well, there's two options. One is start very early so you can clear out soon. Another is cut your education into blocks of time where you could bring a group of students in for a while, have them leave, clean, disinfect, sanitize, bring another group in. That's the stage we're at now. That is, we're currently trying to figure out, if we know how many students we're going to educate, what is the public health, the trajectory of the virus? What are we seeing? Is it likely to be a fall spike, a slow burn, the small wavelets? The CIDRAP group at the University of Minnesota has been very helpful in laying out some of these. And so then we're gaming out calendar and educational delivery for each of those scenarios. What if it's none of those scenarios? What if nothing that we are prepared for happens? Well, now we have the confidence for March. We'll figure it out. We'll just figure out how to do it. But our sequence is public health first, educational delivery next. And then we have to look at what are the finances. That is, depending upon how many students will in fact be paying tuition, how many might be living on campus, then that gives us a certain amount of student revenue. And if that student revenue falls short of what we need, then we're going to go to our alumni, get ready for your letter from me, and really work very hard on our annual fund and make clear the critical nature of not losing an entire year of education. The other thing that we're doing is talking to legislators, both in Congress and in Springfield. And I mentioned this to you before. If you believe, as I think everyone does, that higher education is critical infrastructure for the country, that we are economic engines in our own communities, that we are anchor institutions in terms of civic engagement in our communities. If you believe that our faculty and staff are essential workers, if you believe that we have to maintain the vitality and the diversity of the American higher education system, then we're going to need significant investments at the federal and state scale. We're going to need federal stimulus dollars. And a failure to do that, a failure at the political level to make those investments in higher education is to forfeit the future of a generation of teachers and doctors and engineers and artists and actors and civil servants, all these people whom we educate in our wonderful and many different kinds of institutions of higher ed. We're forfeiting their future. So we just have to make the case for federal investment in our higher ed infrastructure. With 36 million people unemployed, there's not going to be a rapid return to work. The economy is not going to have a V and jump right back up again. This is going to be more like the financial crisis in from 07, 08, 09. It's going to take a while. And it's going to take a while for families to recover. It's going to take a while for the economy to recover. It's going to take a while for our institutions to recover. So there's a political case to be made as well. And, it is a public policy institute. And so it feels to me that this is really an important statement for the Simon Institute, really, to be advocating for federal investment, state investment in this critical infrastructure and in the future of the country.
Tracy, as you know, there's been no shortage of essays written about how this crisis is going to affect higher education over the long term. And I know you've said that Knox's model, I think the average class size is 14, and it is premised on the notion of up close, conversations and discussions and so forth. So the model of, more online learning is probably not something that Knox is just dying to embrace. But as you look ahead, I mean, how is higher education, both in Illinois and nationally, going to be affected long term by this crisis?
Right. Well, I would say that at Knox, some form of online learning will be in our future forever. And I think we're learning that online education does actually have some real value and gifts, in particular that you can reach a much broader audience. So we might, in fact, in the future, have some courses where we could serve a bigger community than we do now. We may not become a 50,000 student institution, but we certainly could serve our traditional stakeholders, our alumni. We could do more alumni education, for example. I think there will be some form of online education in the future always. It also helps with costs, because one of the things we do know there's a limiting factor, particularly for lower income families, is the cost of our education. And to the extent that we can gain cost efficiencies as a result of this grand experiment, having more remote workers, not necessarily having the size or scale of our physical infrastructure, might be good for the climate, might be good for costs. There's a whole lot that we could learn out of this. And I think even the smallest institutions will learn that lesson and find these opportunities and get creative. So I think you are going to see an expansion of those different modalities of delivery, of educational delivery across the board, even from the most in-person and intensive places. We will seek ways to use that to strengthen our mission, our own mission. There will be some institutions who will not make it. There will be consolidation. It's much like you're hearing now that, people are estimating how many restaurants will never reopen, how much the risk reward ratio for some families, family-owned businesses, just is profoundly altered in ways that will change the future. And I think there will be some institutions that will not reopen. I think there will be some institutions that will seize the opportunities that we have now. I think the internationalism of American higher education will take a while to recover. I think it will be a while before the rest of the world sends as many of their talented and promising undergraduates and graduate students. So I think that could be a profound change as well. I hope not. I hope that we reopen to the world in short order, but I fear that may be a permanent, it'll take us a decade to come back to where we were there. And by the time we do, other countries will have developed their own higher ed infrastructure, and we may never regain that position.
Well, as you think about your final year at Knox, how, I think when you had announced that your plans to leave, you'd sketched out a 15-month agenda with a lot of focus on fundraising and enrollment. I mean, in a real sense, is it now just crisis management? I mean, how do you blend crisis management plus looking to the long term?
Yeah, so that's the topic of every single conversation that every administrator, every president is having now. It does seem to me that we've been in crisis management mode for some time now, partly because, as I mentioned, this sort of delegitimation of higher ed in the public sphere. And so we have been fighting a lot of battles for quite some time. I think, for me, it's interesting. Yesterday I was on a call with some college presidents who are retiring, and some who are brand new, who walked in the door in September, and now here they are, right? Um, I had imagined certainly a different final year. I had imagined a lot of travel to alumni groups because Knox alumni have scattered all over the country. And I had imagined that I would be going and seeing smiling faces and thanking them for what they've done for Knox over the past 10 years. And I imagined I would be introducing the new president around to various alumni groups. All of these rituals of transition, presidential transition in higher ed. That's just not, I think, going to happen. Yes, it will be crisis management, but I would come back to where I started, which is we all have to manage a crisis in the context of our own mission and the institutional values, the institutional culture, the theory of the case, different ways of talking about that. So in a way, if my crisis management moment here perpetuates the college for generations to come, if it allows us to learn how to be more nimble, to reach more students, to protect vulnerable students in ways that we didn't fully understand were necessary before, to support our faculty, to reach out for the support of our alumni in ways that do make a more sustainable future for Knox or any other liberal arts college, then certainly my year will have been quite possibly the most valuable year that I spent here. Rather than, I was a little worried about being a lame duck. That's, I don't know what the right metaphor is there, but I certainly don't feel like a lame duck now.
Well, Teresa, as we wind down, I mean, you've had 10 years at Knox, and I wonder just if some kind of broader reflections on just, what this last decade has meant to you, both in terms of Knox and its growth, higher education in Illinois and its challenges, the broader higher education landscape. I mean, if I can persuade you to sit down and write a memoir, what are some of the questions you want to look at, and what are some of the things you want to impart to your successors?
Well, one is I couldn't possibly write a memoir right now because I can't remember what happened yesterday. We're all having trouble. A memoir does involve some capacity to remember the past. And it seems as if we're in such a present moment. Right? But, one reflection, of course, for me, and you mentioned my father was a Foreign Service officer. Well, he was a Midwesterner. And I hadn't lived in the Midwest. That was the one place it seems I'd never really lived. And his father grew up at a dairy farm in Viroqua, Wisconsin. I've gone up there and seen the farm. It has, since it was purchased by my great-great-great-grandfather from Norway, there have been only 2 families that have owned that farm, and it's still a farm. And so growing up, I always thought my dad had these odd personal quirks. He was a humble guy. He didn't put on airs. He was generous. He was very family oriented. He was deeply committed to this country, very, very patriotic, loved his country, served his country in the war and thereafter. And he had a wicked but very sly sense of humor. Well, come to find out, these were not weird personality quirks of my father. He was a Midwesterner. He was born in Fort Scott, Kansas, and he had roots in Illinois and in Wisconsin. So I will take away from my 10 years here a tremendous respect and admiration for the Midwest, for the core values that I see in Galesburg and other Midwestern communities. It's been a privilege to be here during these 10 years. And then I think the 10 years for every college president has been a time of expanding opportunity, greater access, a deeper understanding of inequality at our institutions, of the dangers of elitism, of the need to be open-minded and to privilege and understand other people's perspectives. I say to students when they arrive that they will learn the most from the people the least like them. And I think that is one of the things that we in higher ed have been able to do for the greater society, which is form a bridge across differences and be a voice for inclusion and for equity and diversity. And that's been, I think, the central theme for many college presidents of this decade, punctuated by the occasional existential financial crisis. But it's been a great 10 years.
Well, Teresa, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation, as I knew it would be. So you certainly have not disappointed. And I think for a lot of people at Knox and even in Illinois more generally, I mean, you've been a really staunch advocate for higher education in Illinois. And I think with advocates like you, it's been a really important thing for the development for the whole community. So thank you so much for your great work. And I hope to get back to Galesburg before you're going to be heading off to Pennsylvania when you retire. Tell us a little bit about your retirement plans.
Well, a long time ago when I was a young faculty member at Bucknell University in central Pennsylvania, I had a cabin, a summer cabin, in a county that has one stoplight, the entire county. So we're going to go back there, and I'm just going to talk to the trees for about a year, and then I'll figure out what comes next.
Great. Well, Teresa, again, thank you so very much for joining us, and we will stay in touch. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining another really wonderful conversation about the challenges that we are facing in this new world. So thank you very much. We will have a YouTube clip of this event online in the next couple of days. So thank you so much. Be well, Teresa. Bye-bye.